Welcome to Talk Back. It is Tuesday, February 21st, 2023, and we are in the middle of Black History Month, a month where we're supposed to take account of the history of what's happened in our country, learn from it, make resolutions about how to go forward with more education. But there have been a few snags along the way, sadly. We seem to be living in an era where instead of going forward with our civil liberties and having them improve and having better lives for all of our Americans every day, I think we may be taking some steps backward in today's American culture. What do you think? Well, I have a guest with me today who is a person in the community who's been involved in the Black community in Norwich, the greater community, who has been a champion of civil rights and involved in many of the civic adventures in this community. This is Sheila Hayes. Hi, Sheila. It's good to see you.
Thank you. It's
Hi,
always
Sheila.
good to see you as well.
And you were the you used to be the president of the NAACP branch of Norwich, Connecticut. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Well, let's just kind of start with that, because NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that goes way back to the beginning of the 1900s, doesn't it, when it was founded?
Yes, it was.
Why was it founded so early in the 1900s?
Right. So just before the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded, there was a organization called the Niagara Movement. And that was in 1906. A group of colored men got together and met up in Niagara to talk about the race riots that were starting to happen in the country as a result of the black, after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, and blacks were moving into their own home ownerships, opening businesses. You know, a lot of people have heard about what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma with Black Wall Street. So they were acquiring wealth, and the whites in the country decided that they did not want them in their towns. We know that many of them put up they were called sundown towns, meaning that if you were caught in the town as a black person after the sun went down, you were subject to brutality, beaten, murdered, or whatever, they felt that they wanted to put upon you as a person in their community that they did not want. So the Niagara Movement was the precursor to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And as that movement expanded to include, we had newspaper people get involved. We had Ida B. Wells, who most people don't credit her for really being the first woman, the first person who refused to sit on the back of a train. It wasn't Rosa Parks. Back in the late 1800s, Ida B. Wells refused to move to the back of the train. She worked to help to create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it was officially formed in 1909.
Wow. So, and it still exists, it's weathered the lynching era, the era of Jim Crow, which we'll talk about a little bit, and then into the 50s when the civil rights movement started and Martin Luther King, and the NAACP was a huge force in getting the attorneys, the legal system up to help some of the cases that made history in creating some of the civil rights that made big changes in our laws, and the NAACP is still a force today.
Yes, it is.
Before we go back and talk more about the history of that, let's talk about the trajectory of your life. What is your history? Where did you grow up in Norwich? Where did you grow up?
Right. So my family, I like to start with my family. My father's side, his father was born and raised, and his mother, born and raised in Georgia. And they actually migrated up to New Jersey, Pennsylvania. My mother's side, they were actually Pennsylvania Dutch, mixed indigenous and black. So that is where they met and married. And my family actually traveled. My dad was in the Navy. This is before I was born. So I have older siblings. I'm the second to the youngest. So they traveled. They originally came up to New London. He was stationed at the Navy base in the 1950s. They left, went out to Missouri, and that's where I was born. And my dad actually went to California and then came back, and my mom and my dad decided to come back to Connecticut because they wanted us to be educated here in Connecticut. And so we settled in Norwich. So most of my growing up years has been in Norwich. My education is my foundation here in Norwich. And my mother was actually the first member to take out the first person to take out a membership in the Norwich branch, NAACP. So she is actually credited with being.
So most of your growing up years were here in Norwich.
Yes.
You have an interesting past in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Dutch and Native American. Interesting. Yes. And then in Georgia, so is there slavery back in your family in the past?
Both sides, because my dad's side was born in slavery, and my grandmother, who was Native American Indian, was born. They were actually enslaved in Georgia as well.
So as you were growing up in Norwich, what was your life impacted by that? What kind of thought did you ever give to the fact, wow, my family, they were slaves in my history, and this is important? How did it affect you as you were growing up?
So I will say that growing up, I really thought everybody learned about their history and learned about what happened to black people at home. I mean, that is where we learned our history. Some was taught in school, but most of our history was taught at home. Going from the enslaved, from the transatlantic slave ships to the southern, to our family's history in slavery, and then coming north. So a lot of that was taught at home, and we talked openly about the mistreatment of blacks in this country, and the fact that even in the north, as much as it was always talked about, or in school, that it was blacks, how they were treated in the south, it was also talked about at home, how they were treated in the north. And not all the freedoms and luxuries were afforded to blacks in the north. Even I grew up in downtown Norwich. Even this area, the street that my father was able to purchase a house, I believe we were not the first black family, but we were close to being the first black family living there. The neighbors were great, most of them, but we did have some issues with neighbors who did not want us living in a majority white.
What was the composition then and even now in Norwich? What percentage?
It was very small percentage of blacks lived in Norwich. I want to say between 4 and 6% of Norwich.
Norwich has about, what, 30,000, 40,000 people?
There's about 40,000 people now. And, I mean, the population of blacks in Norwich are about 8 to 10%. It's the Hispanic group is about 20%. So minorities altogether were somewhere around 36, 38%.
But you still had enough of a community to have your own NAACP chapter here, right?
Well, that happened because of incidents that happened of racism. I mean, New London actually had the chapter first. And what happened is that there were incidents, and I can recall because my brother-in-law actually would go over to the Lincoln Inn, where if a black person went in there, they would break the glass after you drank it. They refused, and they really refused to serve.
Where in Norwich?
Lincoln Inn, over on the west side.
Really?
Yes, that was a restaurant and bar.
Is this during your lifetime?
Yeah, it was during my lifetime, because we were not allowed to walk on that side of the street. It's on the west side. I don't want to point out the business that there's no business there now, but it's between what was the Martin Luther King Center and right at the corner just before Walgreens, that area.
So in what years are we talking about? The 50s?
50s, 60s, 70s, yep.
Really?
Yep.
How were you treated in school?
I was not treated differently. My family was not treated differently in school. And my brothers and sisters, we talk about this often. And I believe part of it is because we grew up in the downtown area of Norwich. We did not grow up on the west side of Norwich, which is where the majority of blacks in Norwich, were forced to rent, and later on, that's where they were allowed to own homes.
Right. So, in your school, were you a big, real minority in the school system? Just a couple of kids?
Just a couple. There was two or three.
But you felt, for the most part, accepted?
Yes. I never encountered a racial issue in school.
In school?
Not personally.
But tell me, because one of the issues that we have now, starting in Florida and many other states, they're trying to adjust, change, take away the way we've been teaching, the way we should be teaching history of Black America, the history of slavery, the history of the civil rights movement, the history of Martin Luther King, the history of police brutality, as we'll get into, that's happening in our time right now. What did you learn about your people's history when you were going through school?
So it was the I want to say, it was basic information. I mean, you learned about they talked about the slave trade. You learned about slavery, but in its context, that it was property and part of the business of how plantation owners needed slaves in order to, grow the cotton, pick the cotton, and as well as molasses, sugar cane, all of that. We were taught we were a commodity. We were not human beings in school. But like I said, most of our true history was taught at home. It wasn't taught in the school. It wasn't.
Right. So I've been reading articles now about people are looking back and are trying to look at the education that young people got, our generation and older than that, what they taught them, and were they teaching them that slavery was, as you said, it was an economic thing for the business of the South, and that was the engine, and they left out the moral component of it, and also the idea that America is for the white man, and that there is a white supremacy, and that takes precedence over the races, and that's the feeling amongst America, the American ethos, the American feeling is that we came and we swept across the continent, manifest destiny from the east to the west, and taking care of the Native American population, enslaving the blacks and using them. And are we teaching our children the right things about it, what happened?
So I will say, going back from when I was in school, it's the context is here in Connecticut, and here specifically more in Norwich. Like I said, it was part of just the history. I mean, that's the way you learned it. Then 80s, 90s, that there was a movement to be more inclusive, because in the 1970s was actually the first Black history course that was allowed to even be taught in school.
And just as an aside, the term colored, which was what the word was when you established the NAACP, that's what was the term used in the South for Black people. In the North, when I was growing up in that same era as you were, we used the term Negro. We didn't, when you went down south, you saw color, you saw all the signs, colored water fountain, colored bathroom, colored entrance, and so forth, right? Black only became a phrase more into the 70s and 80s, right?
Well, more of the 60s,
60s,
with the Black Power.
yeah, right.
With the, if you,
Right.
I will probably never forget the Olympics with John Smith and when they in Mexico, when the Black Power symbol, when
Yeah.
they held up their hands and they were treated badly because for them taking a stand during the Olympics.
How was it like that football player, what's his name, who took a knee?
Colin Kaepernick.
Kaepernick, who took a knee, and they haven't forgiven him to this day for that. So let's go back now
Okay.
into the history, because we know after the Civil War, which the North won, and Lincoln had the hope of reconciling the country, and Reconstruction was supposed to heal the country and bring the ex-slavery population into the mainstream. And that started to happen after the Civil War. Blacks, for the first time, became representatives in their states, in Congress, had responsible titles, and were moving up in society. And then it was slammed down. And many of the historians say it's because the troops left that were monitoring the Reconstruction. In 1876, there was an electoral college deal made that the troops would leave the South and Hayes would become president in the electoral college. And then what happened after that, after Reconstruction kind of failed? What happened?
So then that is when you started to see the rise of whites, the white supremacy, Jim Crow. That's when you started to see towns, and they looked at the fact that blacks are coloreds, and they were still called that, for the longest time, mulattoes. That they saw that they were achieving the same equalities through wealth. Many blacks, especially in the South, owned their own properties. They were creating their own business. Blacks supporting black businesses is not so. They started implementing laws. This is where we started to see the lynchings, the burnings happening across the South.
Ku Klux Klan.
Ku Klux Klan started the rise of Ku Klux Klan. The movie Birth of a Nation that was in the early 1920s, when that came out, gave rise to white supremacy and the fact that whites had to take back their country.
Exactly.
And
so the great things that Lincoln helped bring about, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment that ended slavery, that gave equal protection under the law, that gave blacks the right to vote. Not women, though.
Right, but there's black men.
Black men.
Yeah, black men.
We can talk, that's another.
That's a whole other
discussion.
topic. Yes.
The South, after the troops left Reconstruction, the southern states went about passing laws making it difficult to vote.
Correct.
Poll taxes, which they were validated many, many years later. You had to pay a tax. You had to be able to read or write. You had to own certain property in order. So when blacks were voting after the Civil War in droves, they were so happy to finally get that right. That was started to be stripped away, state by state, town by town. And the blacks who had owned some property became sharecroppers and were almost enslaved to the owners of the plantations. They were no longer slaves, but they had to give so much percentage of what they grew to the owners of the land. It wasn't that much better in some ways than being. They were almost slaves to the land, and so you're right. We started a whole system of oppression, of economic enslavement, of taking away voting rights and other human rights, because the South was, I guess, getting its revenge. They couldn't allow that. They were threatened by the rise of the black population becoming an integral part of their society, and they couldn't do that. And they call that Jim Crow laws. And then there were the lynchings, which became a part of the strategy of fear and terror to stop you from wanting to vote, from wanting to be a part of the white world, right, of America. And then in 1896, a very important case, Plessy versus Ferguson, because up to then we still had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment in the United States, and the idea that black Americans could take their place side by side with white Americans. But what did that case do? Tell us about Plessy versus Ferguson. It was so important in the history of our country.
So it established that separate and equal for in education, and an education deemed to be separate, but it deemed to be equal, but it was separate.
Well, not just education, in all facilities.
But
because a black man wanted to sit in a certain section of the railroad car, and he was told you have to sit in the colored section. And the case went to court, and the Supreme Court said, so long as the facilities are equal, so long as the blacks who are riding in that car get the same privileges to be seated properly in the same type of facility, you can't separate them. Equal, separate, but equal. And that was when you started to get the separate soda fountains, the separate water fountains, the separate bathrooms, the separate parks, the separate everything.
Schools and So,
and it took from 1896 to 1954, so a whole half a century, Now, what was happening in those 50 years? There were many struggles. There were terrible things like the Emmett Till episode. Tell us about that.
Oh, Emmett Till. That's even a hard story to talk about. Emmett Till, who family had migrated. Some of his family had migrated to Chicago. Some of the family still lived in the South. He went down south to visit for the summer, and the allegation was that he had whistled at a white woman. She alleged that she thought that he was going to rape her. And
he was a young kid.
He was a young kid. He was 13 years old. And in the course of the evening, the whites showed up at the family house that he was staying at, his uncle and aunt's house, and took him out and tortured him.
Killed him.
And tortured and murdered him.
In the most disfiguring, disgusting way. But his mother made sure that the casket was open and the world could see what had been done to her son.
But she had to do that in Chicago.
Chicago.
In Chicago. His body was taken back. And she then said she wanted the world. It was taken back to Chicago. She said she wanted the world to see what had been done to her son.
Now, at the the Smithsonian American Museum of African American History, they have a wonderful, I mean, it's awful to watch it, but it's important. They have a terrific section just for that. But that was one incident. It became symbolic of the tortures, the oppression that was happening to young black, innocent kids, like just for looking at a white woman, whistling, and even if he was doing that, I mean, and it became a symbol of the oppression, the torture, and the terror that the black community was living under all those years. And that wasn't obviously the only incident. Hundreds of cases of lynching all through those years, where we could not be safe in your home.
But what I just want to say, what is more important about these type of cases is the number of trials that were held, but because the juries were of all white, they were never convicted. So people could talk freely. People talked openly about they participated in these lynchings and murders, knowing that they would never be convicted.
Many acquittals because the juries would acquit the white person who tortured and killed the black. And even in some of these cases, and years later people are coming forward, and but justice is not being
it?
had in the end. So the struggles continued into the 1950s, and in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education case was an educational case where there were separate schools for white kids and for black kids, and the court said, no, that Plessy versus Ferguson idea, it's not right in America. America, under our 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, says separate is not equal. There is a value to integration. And we tried to go on the path. So that segregation was outlawed in facilities, in public facilities, in schools. And we tried to go on the path to integration. But there was tremendous fighting against that on the part of the white community. In the South, in the North, in Boston, they tried to integrate the schools through busing, through things like that. And today, even though we live in a society where there is more diversity and more equality, there's still many neighborhoods that are only black and neighborhoods that are only white, right?
Right. So, because sometimes what we don't focus on or we don't talk about it, we talk about the educational piece of it, but we also don't talk about the fair housing laws. And we don't talk about today how redlining, financial institutions, and realtors, and that whole industry, mortgage lenders, they're still practicing redlining in certain communities, and I'm talking right here in Connecticut. Not, we don't always have to go down south to understand the impact of what, if you steer, if you guide potential homeowners away from a more affluent community because you don't want to integrate it, and then if you guide the white people away from those sections that have been deemed black or brown, and you devalue the houses that are there, and that's been the other big topic coming out, that a black person that wants to sell their house, they reduce the amount of that house, the value of it, by at least 20-25%. If you put a white family there, that house goes up 120% over the value of the house.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's still happening in our society. So when you look and say, so yes, the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson, but it didn't address and fair housing and affordable housing hasn't still been addressed.
Well,
and that's what causes the separation of the community.
So two things. Another example of the terror post-Reconstruction of Jim Crow is there was a growing economically secure, well-to-do community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And there was a riot, and they destroyed that section of Tulsa that was being developed by blacks, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that was part of it. And interesting, when Martin Luther King came along, his first goal was equal rights, to try to integrate, to bring blacks and whites together in a nonviolent way. Toward the end of his life, where did he die? In Memphis. And what was he doing? It was a garbage strike. His point was, well, we have our freedom, perhaps maybe to vote now, maybe. But what about the economic push to make us equal parts of our society? So the unions were important to him, and he was there the day he died, helping the unions, helping the workers who was striving for better pay and better conditions. Very, very important. And now let's get to criminal justice. Okay. Because now we got two issues that are burning up in our country today. One is the issue of police brutality against black men. The last case being in Memphis, the Nichols case. Starting back in the 90s, we had the Rodney King case, we had the Floyd case, we had so many cases. Those were maybe the tip of the iceberg of what was going on, because the importance of being able to have that iPhone now, or that camera, because that has revolutionized the fact that, wow, we see what you're doing now, right? So how has that made it
But it
change?
hasn't stopped, right. But the unfortunate thing about it is we can see it, it's videotaped, or, back then it was camcorders and now it's, on the phones, but it hasn't stopped. It has, I mean, that's the crux of, you have the police brutality, but what I've said to people is we're not focusing on the court system. So if you stop and think, the George Floyd murder was probably one of the most significant court cases. And the outcome of that case, you would have thought would have stopped what we're seeing continuing to happen. And it hasn't. So it doesn't matter if somebody if it's a police officer who is charged with murder, or the case in the Aubrey case where they were trying to do a civil arrest of him, and they have been indicted and charged and now facing jail time, but we continue to see it happening. So there's something else in our system,
in our culture, right?
Then we need to
people
address.
don't like to hear the word systemic racism or systemic violence. People like to think, well, that's just one bad apple,
and it's not.
But there is something in the culture of police work, because after all, those officers in Memphis were black as well. So what do you think about that? There must be something in the culture of police work that affected even the black officers to act the way they did toward this kid.
Right. So if you're in a system where you have absolute authority, which is what a badge and a shield and a gun gives you, and forget the oath that they took, because everybody says, well, we all take the same oath, okay? But if you're once you put that uniform on, if you're training and your approach to your work is that you are the supreme authority, and that badge and shield and gun gives you the right to treat anybody, especially a black male or a black female or a brown black male or brown male or female.
So those black officers,
they
got caught up in that too.
But it's the officers, but also look at everybody else that was caught in that video. I mean, these are first responders, not just police officers. There were first responders. Some of them were white. Some of them were. It's what happened. What is it that happened when they all converged? Go back to the George Floyd case. They were not all just white officers, okay, that stood there and watched a man get murdered. So what is it that is it the training? Is there something being ingrained in that particular police department? Because, over the years, especially since the George Floyd case, I've had many talks with Chief Daly, the chief of the Norwich Police Department, as well as other officers. And they say that should have never happened. Every time they will say, that's not our training, that's not what we promote. So why is it still happening? And until we can get underneath, is it what they bring with them already to the job that just surfaces now that they're in this authoritarian position, that they have a badge and they feel that they can do whatever they want to do to whoever they choose to take it out on. So I think there needs to be more research, more digging deeper down into what is it that possesses people who take an oath, who are supposed to be protecting society, following the laws, okay, and including the first responders who respond at the same time. What is it that allows them to cross that line?
Right. And it makes you think of how many hundreds, thousands of other incidences where this brutality existed when nobody was around to take a video, to record it in any way, and where the only evidence of what the person who was accused of a crime did was the evidence of the arresting policeman.
Right.
And they were believed for the most part. And what part does racism play in that?
And we know the color of a person's skin, whether somebody says they're racist, they're prejudiced, you know, you know, or I have my prejudice, Sheila, I'm not racist, okay? But as soon as you identify a person based on the color of their skin, okay, you are segregating how you are going to take an action, how you are going to act and or react to that person. And that is known, and we've seen it over and over. So until we start addressing that, you know, that you're not, that a person is never really colorblind, because you've got to see a person's color. And then what are those images every time you see a person of that race or that ethnicity? What images do you have? And we see it all the time. It's automatically to go into a defense mode, is what we're told. Yeah. If it's a black person and a person who is obviously black, they're perceived as a threat.
And it was interesting that President Biden, in his State of the Union speech, talked about the talk, which is very very revealing, that he understands what it is that black families go through. Tell us, what is the talk?
Well, it's I can tell it to you from my family growing up, and what I passed on to my kids is that when you are on the streets, you know, when you are outside the house, you have to be aware of your surroundings. You have to be aware that at any time you can be targeted. You can be, you know, you don't have to be doing anything. And it's not about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Somebody can just decide that day they don't like you based on the color of your skin. And you're going to suffer those consequences of their actions. And in most cases, the laws still favor a person who is Caucasian over a person who is of color. In most cases, they're still going to be treated differently. The case is going to be treated differently, versus if it was a black person committing the crime on another black person, they're not going to be treated the same as a white person who committed that crime against another human being because of the color of their skin. So it's just, I mean, I tell my kids the same thing. Be mindful. You have lots of friends, as I was taught. There was no part of Norwich that I didn't feel welcome. Tappville, which was basically French Canadian, Greenville, you know, there weren't a lot of blacks that lived in some of the sections that I had friends in. But I was always taught, be mindful. People know you're black. People know what you are, and you could always be targeted. And just be aware, and don't put yourself in situations where somebody could go after.
And you tell the kids, especially the boys, what to do if the police approach you?
You can, yes, you do, but I'm going to tell you, as my son and my nephews and other young black men say, but Miss Hayes, you tell us all of this and we do it. Okay, it still doesn't stop them.
Well, look, exactly. In the Nichols case,
that doesn't stop
he was
them.
the one who seemed to be trying to de-escalate the violence.
Yeah, right.
And they were saying things to him that belied what was happening. They were saying, "Don't stop resisting." He wasn't resisting. He's, you know, it was unbelievable. So this is Black History Month. Mm-hmm. So you and I have been talking that we've come far, but we seem to be, we're not there yet, are we?
No.
We're not there yet. You don't feel 100% comfortable that as a black American you can live free economically, socially, voting rights. They're trying, we can spend another half hour talking about how they're trying to cut down on the boxes where you can put your absentee ballots in, or less polling places in black neighborhoods, and cutting back on the early voting. Now in Connecticut, we're going to be passing laws, hopefully, that will give us early voting and stuff, because our Constitution demands that we do that. But Black history, we have examples in Florida and in many other states. They're trying to pass laws telling teachers that you can't teach too much about LGBTQ. You can't talk about gay issues. and you can't talk about certain race issues that will make the white kids feel guilty that they may have been a part of the oppression of black people. And they're trying to stifle discussion of certain black issues. I read that there was a very charming black author who wrote books about his children, his black children, and he was invited by a parents group to come to a community to speak, I think in Florida. And there was an outrage by the other members of the community. They made him he couldn't come. And not only couldn't he come, they took the books he wrote,
off of
the children's books he wrote, off the shelves because they thought he was teaching critical race theory. It was too much stuff about how white people are guilty of, which that wasn't the case in his books. What's going on? How do we stop this?
Well, so what's going on is, let's be honest. Former President Trump made it mainstream to call out and say critical race theory is teaching our children in school about anti-whiteness. Okay? And critical race theory was not being taught in public schools. It was being taught in law school. It's a legal
right. It's a legal right about certain systemic issues and legal. Yeah.
Right. Then you now hear the Governor DeSantis as well as the one in Texas. Well, because as a result of George Floyd and the protests, now all you people that became woke, now we want you to become unwoke because it's damaging our school system. It's damaging our kids. You're making white people feel uncomfortable. The 1619 Project is another attack on the bringing forward of what the true history of that blacks had to endure. Okay, that's again being told, no, that's anti-American, that's anti-white American. So you have this whole movement that is appealing. Let's face it, they're not appealing to you and I. They're appealing to rural whites that are living in the rural areas of our country who feel that this country, especially after President Obama, the first black president was elected, they feel like they've lost something as being white Americans. They haven't lost anything.
Well, the irony is that the country is getting more diverse. That I was reading that young people under the age of 18, the majority of them are not white now. The plurality are black. We're going to have pretty soon, the Hispanics are going to have a plurality in our country. And you're saying those white, rural, less educated are being frightened, because their world is going away. And so these movements, whether it's the police brutality or the trying to take away what they call wokeness and change education, is a way to stave off the inevitable change in our culture. Most of us are becoming more diverse, more knowledgeable, more inclusive between the gay community, the Jewish community, the black community, the brown community. We want inclusiveness. They can't abide it, and so they're doing everything they can to stop it.
Right.
It's not going to be stopped, but in the meantime, they're terrorizing us.
Right, but I'm going to say to you that, because I can remember in the early 90s, because if you put fear into people who have been privileged, because you're talking about people who have been privileged by the color of their skin, by their race. There was the fear in the 90s that blacks were integrating the multiracial marriages, and all of a sudden America is going to become so brown, white race is going to disappear. That was fear. It didn't happen. The black population really has not changed that much in this country. Okay, it's still 8 to 10%. It was 8 to 10% back then. It's still 8 to 10% now. If you can instill fear in people and make them believe because of their privilege, because of their race, that they're losing something.
Right.
Okay?
That's what Trump was successful at.
That's
yes.
what is happening.
And now
Because
DeSantis in Florida is doing
is
the same
doing
thing.
the same
and
thing
it's funny,
in Abbott
woke
in
used to be
Texas.
a good connotation. When you were woke, I mean, you were conscious. You knew what was happening around you. You knew what was going on in the world. You understood things. You were educated. And now they're turning that whole word around. I mean, it's
right. They're turning it to make it negative. And that's what I'm saying. That's fear. That's because I'll tell you, I watched Florida. And some people disagreed with me. They said, no, Sheila, that didn't happen. But it did. You watch, there's a section of Florida that is a large Cuban population. Yeah. And the things that they were saying to this group of people, that we want to impose socialism. Okay, that's that fear.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why they left Cuba, communism.
Right.
They use those words. We sit up there and we say, this country is not going towards communism.
I know.
We have fought this country, that battle a long time ago. But you saw them use those words, and it put fear in people.
Exactly.
Okay, and so
and most people could never define what socialism is. Right?
It is right. But I'm just I sat there and I was just amazed how people who are from a privileged class will prey upon people who are not from a privileged class, knowing that if they use certain buzzwords, it puts fear in them.
Yes, and that's what this is about.
And that's what this is about.
But this push to ban books and to tell teachers what to teach, it is so anti-democratic.
But they've done this. This is not the first. This is not the first time. Yeah. Okay, I mean we've had we've had that group. I'm going to say, let's say, my kids are for the past at least 40 years, and there may have been some before that, but for at least 40 years, there's always been a group that wanted to ban some type of book. What is happening, though, is because we have moved the needle that it's not just about race, as you've mentioned, the LGBTQ community.
Well, it's abortion. We're turning back the clock on a lot of stuff.
So as those groups are now becoming more empowered, okay, to be open and to be vocal, again, it's that fear. It is, and so you talk about black police officers. I'm going to tell you part of the fear that some of us have is we've seen our black ministers, okay, become part of this fear mongering. We're going to instill fear in you if you, like the LGBTQ. That was a big issue in the NAACP. One of our presidents and CEOs really reached out to the LGBTQ community, and the black ministers pushed back terribly against that.
Well, we could go on forever talking about this, but now we are in Black History Month.
Yes.
What would you say is the most important thing that American people, our kids, should know about Black history?
Black history is American history. That's what we've said it. It is. I mean, Black history started off as Negro Week to bring attention. Then it was expanded to a month. But it is actually part of the fabric and the very foundation every day, 365 days of the year, that it is American history. And we have to remember that and move towards that. It's not a month. It's a movement.
Okay. Well, it's great to have you here. Come back again. There's so many things we can go further to discuss. So, Black History Month, please know your history, learn about it. Learn about the movements in this country that are trying to, I think, take us back from the civil liberties that we have won the past 100 years. What do you think? We'll talk to you next time on Talk Back. Goodbye. Bye.